Hello and welcome to Varn blog. And today I'm discussing a blog post by Corey Robbins. Israel came late to American Jews. And it's a reflection partly on the death of his mother. As someone whose mother died almost a year ago from when I'm recording this in early January of 2025, I feel it. But this is not just a chance for me to get personal. And in fact, my precarious relationship to Jewish identity, it's not established through my mom, even though my mom had a relationship to Judaism. She was ethnically Scotch-Irish and Welsh. The family names in her history were like Stewarts and Whitakers and McCullens and Conahays and Davids. Although she was adopted by a man named Reese and came from another Eastern Central European mutt family that's name was anglicized to Turner. Now, my father, however, even though he was a Varn, there was Jewish descent on both his family lines, and they were primarily crypto Jews. And that means in my ancestry, I have family relationships to, for example, the O'Connors, the Flannery O'Connor's family. And Milledgeville is distant relatives of mine, but also the Kahanas are distant relatives of mine through some Jewish family. And my Jewish family seems primarily Sephardic. Now, you probably don't need to know all that, but that ambivalence has always extended to my distrust of nationalisms, because having grown up around Catholics and some Jews who had various relationships to nationalisms outside of the United States, it always seemed to me to be an easily abused category. So anyway, that's my personal reflections on the matter. Let's get into this reflection by Corey Robbins. My mom died last month. Going through some of the personal items she left for me, I found this book. And for those of you who see it, it's a very worn, beat up The Jews of the America History and Sources book. It looks like it's from the 70s, maybe even the 60s, given the fonts and coloration. The Jews of America was a textbook that virtually all of my sisters and I used in religious school. Our Sunday school, as it was called in Reform synagogues of the time, because they were assimilating. As we made our way towards our bar and bat mitzvahs, it's how we learned about Jewish history and heritage, not just in America, despite the title, but across time and space. Ours was a typical Reform temple in the suburbs. So I assume this was a pretty standard text. The book came out in 1969 with a new edition in 1973. And my sisters and I would have used it between roughly 74 and 84. So yeah, so Robbins is older than me. If you look at these 3 pages of the table of contents, what do you notice? And let's actually look at it. We see here Jews in early America, links with Columbus, Golden Age in Spain, the Seraphim and the Ashkenazim, the New Amsterdam. The Seraphim, by the way, were by far the dominant group early on. Later on, the Ashkenazim came. New Amsterdam, Newport, Rhode Island, Philadelphia, Charlestown, Jews in the American Revolution. Jews from Germany and Central Europe, 1820, 1880. The medieval myth, the ghetto, Poland. Return to the West, fall of the ghettos, Jews from Germany, religious and community life, blah, blah, blah. All right. Jews from Eastern Europe, 1880 to 1924. Russia and the Jewish Pale of Settlement. Village life, immigrants, New York's East Side, people at work, Jewish, the people's speeches, the Yiddish press, the Yiddish theater, food. A lot of the things in the early 20th century that define Jewish culture that I have no relationship to at all, actually, because they're not part of my culture. But nonetheless. All right. And then we get another page, identity, religious freedom in the public schools. Emma Lazarus realizes her Jewish identity, a letter on peoplehood, poetry of a young Jew, community, joining the community, Jewish self-government, synagogue, a center of Jewish life, the German Jews' reaction to the Polacks, family, land of opportunity, family unity in suburbia, the language gap, Bento Brief solves the family problem, religion, the evolution of Reform Judaism in America, reactions against Sunday Sabbaths, the founding of the Jewish Theological Seminary in America, the joys of the Jewish home life, Jewish values in suburbia, the significance of Passover today, and then lastly, education, memories of a Hebrew school, modern Jewish education, education conflicts with the family, the role of the woman's role in Jewish life, the forwards call for women's emancipation, the importance of education, a Jewish publisher meets the needs of young people, integration, the first Jewish prayer in Congress, the Sabbath conflicts with the life of America, processing of immigrants in Ellis Island, much more important to Ashkenazi than to me. But anyway, return to the soil. An immigrant Americanizes himself, disillusionment over the land of opportunity, the future of Jewishness, anti-Semitism, resentment against Jews, the JDL reacts to persecution, a Jew defends his honor, stealing across the border, American Jews protest the pogroms, the American students demonstrate for Soviet Jewry, a Dearborn independent, an American Jew in the army, and American Jews react to the Holocaust. You will notice, as I just did, and I think this is what Corey Robbins wants us to notice, there's not a damn mention of Israel in those contents. It might be mentioned in the book, but it's not in the table of contents. And as he points out, virtually the entire book from pages 7 to 146 has hardly a mention of the state of Israel or Palestine. Only on the very last 2 pages of the book does Israel appear in any substantive way. It doesn't even merit an entry in the index, although other countries like Germany and Russia, Poland and Spain and Portugal have their own entries with multiple pages referenced. I don't want to overstate things. As I've written before, Israel was a big part of my family's Jewish life in the 1970s and 1980s, and it became, over time, a big part of our synagogue's life. Asterisk, when I went to a Reform/conservative synagogue here in SLC to try to reconnect, and even in a secular way, with the Jewish part of my heritage, I had a hard time with it because the emphasis placed on Israel. Like, almost like you're joining the nation of Israel, and that, and that means the nation of Israel, both spiritually and also like as a tangible place. And since, so many of my family members were running away from any Jewish identity or denying it, this didn't really play a huge role in my formation. So I never had a strong attachment to the nation of Israel. And in fact, I never really bought into the need for its existence. I mean, I remember even as a teenager going, well, why don't the Holocaust survivors of the Shoah why don't the survivors of the Shoah get part of Germany or one of the Axis powers land? I just remember thinking that as a kid, and still kind of thinking it. All right, but that's the point. Over time, initially, I'm talking about the mid-70s and before, it wasn't that important. Historians have written about this, how Israel came late to America. Though they debate the causes of the increasing Zionism of American Jews, there's little doubt that it was sparked and stirred by a combination of the 1967 Arab-Israeli War and the rise of Black and other forms of identity politics in the United States. It has less to do with the Holocaust and anti-Semitism than with the changing status of white ethnics in the face of the Black freedom struggle. But judging by this text that my very mainstream temple chose and continued to use well into the 1980s, it took a while for that sense of nationalism to spread deep into and across the Jewish American community. It really wouldn't be until the 1980s that it became a central pillar of Jewish American identity. Another point that Joshua Laffer made in his excellent Tablet Shattered. Now, this is something that I find very interesting. It's not that, most American Jews would have been prominent anti-Zionist or anything, or even as divided as, like, say, Jews under 30 are about Israel today. But the pillars of the community being that tied to Israel as a source of their identity as an extension of that nation really does seem to develop in the 80s. I mean, part of that is just the changing nature of the development of Israel itself and its settler colonial, expansion. But it also seems to be deeply rooted in concerns later on. Now, I think there's an overstatement about the amount of Christian Zionism there is in the world, but pushing back on a friend of mine who says it's not really that big a deal, I do want to remind people that even if only like 10% of evangelicals were Christian Zionists or were so inclined, and that would be a generous estimation, that would still be a much larger group than the number of Jews in the United States today. And there were people very concerned about this, even in left milieus in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. After all, those, quote, Trotskyists, mostly actually social democrats, around Shachtman, who became pretty ardent Zionist, often came out of both the SWP and, believe it or not, even though this isn't talked about a lot because it doesn't fit anyone's narrative very well, the CPUSA. Remember, Harold Cruz was complaining about them in his The Problems of the Negro Intellectual in the 1960s. There was a left movement for Zionism pretty early on, but it doesn't seem to have been that integrated into temple life and in the religious identity of American Jews until later. I find this fascinating. I mean, in my own world and family, a lot of the Christians are more supportive of Israel than the non-Christians, and I've always found that kind of interesting. But it does seem to me like what really began as a Bismarckian nationalist project with a settlerist orientation that kind of built itself on prior Zionist movements, which were not always political. There were cultural Zionist movements in the Ottoman Empire for Ottoman Jews, for example, to return to the Mandated Palestine, but they really weren't trying to take it over in the way Herzl and co. were stating. And it does seem like the use of the Shoah for this really begins probably in the 60s and 70s and becomes really prominent in the 80s and 90s. Which means that there is a specific age range where this is like a settled question in the Jewish community. And it really is settled amongst a lot of the holders of institutional power and like Jewish associations who would have come of age in the 60s and 70s and had gone through this major pillar of support of Israel being part of American Jewish identity in the 80s and 90s and established themselves as the primary donors and whatnot in a lot of these civic groups. I would also like to know, like when the expansion of birthright trips happened, etc., etc. But it is interesting that it came really late. I mean, birthright trips, interestingly, were not part of my youth, and I didn't, again, I didn't really have that much relationship to a large Jewish community in my youth, but it makes sense now because it seems like the first trips were in 1999. And from then, it became the largest educational tourist organization, propaganda organization in the world. It's fascinating because the way history works, we tend to forget that stuff that's relatively new is relatively new. It's just something to think about. Protect your peace, like and subscribe, and keep on hoping for a better tomorrow. If you want more, hit the bell. And if you want even more, there's a Patreon. You can get audio access to everything for as little as $4 with additional videos and stuff going up from there. And if you don't want to do that, I'll take a comment or review the podcast on any of your podcast apps, although this isn't part of the free podcast, but whatever. We'll take all the help we can get. But yeah, it's fascinating how recent things can be naturalized as if they've always been there.